Hey, welcome to Beer Christianity. My name's Jonty. It is me alone, talking to you today from the Eastern Cape in South Africa, in Dlumbi in the Eastern Cape. I am drinking a thing called melktert, the flippin' lekker melktertjie, cream liqueur. I've just had an evening talking politics with my parents, which is not always a fun thing to do, I'm sure many of you think, but tonight it was really fun. My mother and I polished off a bottle of J.C. Leroux Sauvignon Blanc, and I am now drinking melktert, and I'm home. And I want to talk to you tonight is when I'm recording it. I'm recording it in the evening. You may be listening in the morning, in which case it's quite early to be drinking, although is it ever too early? I want to talk to you about Palestine and about being a Christian or Christian adjacent, and why you should care about Palestine, why you should support Palestine, and why Israel is the bad guy. Is what I'm going to say. Let's talk about it in black and white terms, because at this point in Rafah, a displaced population, refugees, internally displaced people in a refugee camp, in a displacement camp, have been bombed. They went to the place they were told they would be safe, many people killed on the way, and they're being bombed. Children are dying in flames in tents. It's horrific. So I want to talk to you about Israel-Palestine just for a bit. First of all, why should you care? There's so many bad things going on. There's always so many bad things going on. If you single out Israel, isn't that just anti-Semitic? Isn't that just singling out Israel and holding them to a different standard? First of all, it's not anti-Semitic to be critical of the State of Israel. The State of Israel and the Zionist project was criticized by many Jewish people when it first came about in the late 1800s and the early 20th century. And it is criticized now by loads of Jewish people. There is nothing anti-Semitic about being critical of Zionism. Zionism is the philosophy behind having a Jewish ethno-state in the land that is currently called Israel, in Palestine. There are a lot of criticisms for it. I think the main criticism is that having an ethno-state is gross. It is immoral. It's a lot like saying, hey, let's have a state in the southern tip of Africa that is primarily for white people. Like, you can have some brown people and some black people, that's fine, but they're going to be mostly there to serve the state. It would be gross, right? It would be wrong. An ethno-state or a religious state, let's say a caliphate somewhere, that'd be wrong. We'd all be like, but what about people who aren't into that? What about people who aren't that, but who need to live there? Do we just displace them? And that's the central problem of the State of Israel. When people say, doesn't the State of Israel have a right to exist? Well, it depends. Because does a state have a right to exist in the form where it is only or primarily for one race or one religion? In which case, I have problems with that. Do the people in that state have a right to live without being slaughtered? Yes, absolutely. Do the Jewish people in Israel have a right to live and not be targeted because they were Jewish? Absolutely. But does a state have a right to exist? Does a state have a right to defend itself? Well, the question you've always got to ask is, if you say yes when it's about Israel, do you say yes when it is about Palestine? One of the things you're going to be told by your Zionist friends or family will be that there is no such thing as Palestine, but Palestine existed. Palestine had stamps, Palestine had an airport, Palestine had currency. The fact that it was under the Ottoman Empire is not really Palestine's fault, because a lot of countries were under empires and didn't exist before decolonization. The sad thing for Palestine is that it was followed by more colonization. That sounds like a confrontational and controversial thing to say, that the Israeli project is a settler colonial project. But it is the truth. The architects of Zionism, and you can just look up the initial documents, considered it a colonial project. They thought of it as colonialism, as settler colonialism. They anticipated that there would be pushback from the indigenous people, and they said that they must settle the land anyway. So, if you have a problem with the genocide of the Native Americans in America, and you really should, if you have a problem with any colonial project, with any domination of an indigenous people by an incoming people, then you have to have a problem with Israel. But what about the Holocaust, you say? The Holocaust was one of the greatest, if not the greatest evil of the 20th century, and possibly of several centuries. Although the Jewish people have suffered many pogroms and many decimations and persecutions, often by Christians, often by secular states. I would argue that the Nazi Germans were secular more than Christian, but there were a lot of Christians who participated, so we can't just go, hey, that wasn't us. Jewish people have been persecuted for generations, and then the anti-Semitism of Europe culminated in the Holocaust, starting in Germany. Please understand, the anti-Semitism was there in England. It was there in America, even into the late 20th century, and now there were little snide jokes about Jews not being allowed in country clubs and that sort of thing. Anti-Semitism, to be clear, is satanic, it is evil, and if you blame Jewish people for what is happening now, you are engaging in anti-Semitism, and you are wrong, and also very gross, morally gross. The Holocaust was a crime against humanity, and specifically a crime against the Jewish people, as well as Roma traveler people, as well as communists, as well as the LGBTQ plus community and political dissidents, and a whole bunch of people who are actually being targeted right now in many countries in vicious and violent, overtly ways, or in just soft, Conservative Party kind of ways. But they were targeted. But the Jewish people were by far the most targeted and the most persecuted by a European power. And when the time came to make amends, European powers said, you know who should pay for this? Is the indigenous and local people in Palestine, in the Ottoman Protectorate, in the British Protectorate. What was it then? 48. It was the British Mandate of Palestine. They should pay for this. Not, say, Britain, who refused Jewish refugees during the Second World War, while Hitler and the Nazis were persecuting. Not America, who is so involved in the Middle East right now. They rejected loads as well. Anne Frank could have survived, but was turned down any kind of asylum. Let's remember that. The Holocaust was a great, huge evil. Nazism is on the rise right now, and unfortunately they are allying with exactly the people who are backing the State of Israel because they like authoritarian regimes. But Jonty, why should Christians care about this? I mean, it's just one conflict, right? It's not. It's the moral issue of our global political world right now. That doesn't mean that Palestinian lives are more important than lives in South Sudan or Congo or anywhere else. It means that geopolitically this is symbolic, it is symptomatic, and it is pivotal to what is happening in the rest of the world. Israel is a vassal state of the US, and increasingly, because of its power over its politicians through CUFI, the Christians United for Israel, through AIPAC, and other Israel-backing pressure groups who pay huge amounts into the campaign funds of politicians who care more about staying in power than about doing the right thing. America is kind of Israel's vassal state, because America keeps on saying, don't do that, will get angry, and Israel goes, no, you won't. Because they know that the politicians are bought and paid for. They know that years and years of anti-Arab, anti-Muslim propaganda is going to mean that the population that votes in the US are going to go, yeah, but I don't know, I can't side with people who they've called terrorists because it was not in America's interests to call them freedom fighters, because America wants a little state that can be their embassy, their center of power militarily in the Middle East. Not that they don't have military bases all over the Middle East and all over the world, because they are in fact an empire. So the issue of Israel is the issue of American imperialism around the world. It is about one state enforcing its will on the rest of the world, be it economically or politically. It is one country funding genocides and killings and dictatorships because it wants to protect primarily its financial interests. Remember, the Cold War was a war against communism, which is fundamentally an ideology that says the poor and the workers should own more of the pie that they create. And America represents capitalism, which says the people who have money already should be protected, should own more. That's what capitalism is. The people with capital get to make more money from their capital. The Cold War was against people who threatened that. And that war has continued because you don't have communism anymore everywhere, but you do have people who challenge American interests and who say, actually, we don't love that you're in charge of everything. Israel doesn't do that because Israel knows that they get the backing of the US and they can do whatever they want. Israel is an ethno-state, as we've mentioned. It means that it is, I think, primarily white supremacist, though by no means all Jewish Israelis are white. But it is white supremacist, and if you look at the history of how Israel has treated, for instance, Ethiopian Jewish people, it has been fairly appalling, as well as treated Bedouins and obviously Arab citizens of Israel and the Palestinians as well. The fact that there are Jewish-only roads, the fact that their citizenship is not defined and their nationality in the census is not allowed to be defined as Israeli. It must be Jewish or Arab or any of those sorts of things, because it becomes problematic if you can call yourself Israeli while being Palestinian or of Arab descent. Do you see why that's a problem? Do you see why a country that says we don't like that as an idea because that could threaten us being primarily Jewish is a problem? You can say, oh, well, that's innocuous, they need a place, they're so persecuted. Imagine a black-only state and how you would feel about that. Would that be okay? Would that be fair? Again, I mean, I have more sympathy for that because they've been oppressed, but again, is that okay? Does that make sense? How do you define that? Who gets to define that? The point is that during South African apartheid, there were other great injustices happening in the world, but the world, including places where those injustices were happening, rallied together to say, absolutely not. We cannot allow this. We must fight it. And one of the main reasons is because it was being backed, because it was being funded, because it was being given military protection by the West, by nations like Britain, by nations like the United States of America. They were funding and backing the apartheid state because it was anti-communist, because it was a useful pawn in the larger imperial game that America was playing in the same way that Britain played imperial games in the century before it. When we in the West think about the global bad guys, we think about a few very specific nations, but I have to ask you, how many people have they killed? How many countries have they invaded? Because I'm sure you have people in your mind right now, but I have to ask you, how many? And do they come anywhere close to what NATO has done, what Britain has done, what the UK and the US and Canada have done. The groups you think of as terrorists now are equivalent to the groups like the ANC who Nelson Mandela fought for. You're being told that these groups are evil and terrorists in the same way that your parents were told that Nelson Mandela is an evil terrorist, that Bishop Desmond Tutu is an evil terrorist sympathizer and apologist who brings too much politics into the church. But the church should be political when it comes to issues of morality and issues of global injustice, and that's what this is. It's one nation, and not even a nation, because the average ordinary American is suffering because of their country's support for Israel. They are suffering without healthcare while Israelis get their healthcare paid for by the billions being sent to them by the USA. They are suffering because increasing and ever more right-wing governments in Israel do increasingly unhinged and unconscionable things to the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people respond in the way that you would, in the way that I would, in the way that anyone we know would, and many of our compatriots would, even if we are pacifists. They say, actually, I have to fight back because we tried peaceful means, as the Palestinians have many times. The first Intifada was peaceful, I think. Pretty sure. Anyway, a lot of the peaceful stuff has been cracked down on. 2018, the March of Return to Gaza, peaceful protesters just massacred. You look at just look up, if you're not sure, look up comparative death tolls of civilians among Palestinians and Israelis and ask yourself where the power lies. Ask yourself who the victims are. Ask yourself who the aggressors are. Ask yourself what self-defense looks like. You see, Desmond Tutu was right to talk about apartheid and politics. I remember as a small child in South Africa growing up and being told by an elderly relative who was a passionate Anglican that Desmond Tutu was a wicked, wicked man because he was bringing politics into the pulpit. Except it's easy to say that when your life is not impacted by the injustice, when you don't have to carry a pass to move around the country because of your race that has to be signed by somebody of a superior race in order to be able to have freedom of movement, because that was the truth in South Africa. And while it's not called the pass system, it is indeed true of somebody, for instance, who is Palestinian, who lives in Bethlehem, who wants to find work in the economic powerhouse neighbor that is Israel. Economic powerhouse because America and Europe support so much of its exports and also don't cut off aid every time they vote for somebody objectionable, which is what they did to the Palestinians in Gaza. Archbishop Desmond Tutu was right to speak out about it because it is a justice issue and because we worship a God of justice, because the God of the Bible is a God of justice. You are going to hear a lot of arguments from Christian Zionists that say, but what about prophecy? I'm going to say that prophecies are hard to interpret and easy to manipulate. I'm going to say that most scholars believe that many of these prophecies refer to things that have already happened in history. More importantly, I'm going to say, from what you know about Jesus Christ, from what you know about his Father God, do you believe that he would want what is happening now in Gaza? Would the God who said, turn the other cheek, would the God who said, love your enemies, give to anyone who asks them, would that God, the God who when he is being tortured to death says, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do, do you think he wants the kind of twisted logic that tells Christians it's okay to say, well, they have to defend themselves? I don't think he would. I don't think he does. I think Jesus weeps over Gaza. I think he weeps over Rafah. I think he weeps over every civilian killed. I think he weeps over every combatant killed on both sides. I think our God does not sign blank checks based on race. And you can believe what you want about the first covenant and the second covenant, but there is a second covenant. Our faith is not in a God who believes primarily in one ethnicity, right or wrong, and who commands them to massacre people. That's not what we believe. And if that is what you believe, you need to discard the New Testament and stop calling yourself a Christian. The fact is that there was a nation, a people, a land full of people when the State of Israel was created. Those people were terrorized out of it. Read up on the history. They were terrorized out of their homes. They are not allowed to return. Meanwhile, anyone who claims Judaism or Jewish ancestry is allowed to return. That is no hate to those people, but it is a weird system where people who still have the keys to the houses their families were dispossessed of are not allowed to return. And people who have not been there and whose families have not been there for hundreds of years, if not thousands, are. The Palestinian people have been incredibly patient. We should keep in mind that outside of our own Christian ethic, the world dictates that it is okay to fight back against oppression. Under international law, if you are occupied and the occupying force is behaving badly towards you, which I think you could say is true from a nation that calls occasionally bombing civilian populations, mowing the grass. I think you can say that they're being treated badly. I think you can justifiably say you're being treated badly if children are imprisoned by military courts in military prisons with adults. I think you can say that's probably not okay. I think, there's so much that Israel does to Palestinian people that is just abhorrent. And you can understand why they would fight back. Does that mean you have to love Hamas? No, obviously not. I would say, though, that when people talk about Hamas from the Zionist position, they talk about the Hamas Charter, which Hamas has not operated under for decades. They have rejected it, they have moved on. And yet they are still held to be somehow beholden to this ideology, which does have anti-Semitism in it, which is evil and wrong, but which they are not allowed to be perceived as having moved on from, even though people in the Israeli government who are part of parties who have had wildly problematic, racist, genocidal documents, founding documents of their own, are not held to the same thing. The standards are never the same. But no, you don't have to love Hamas. You do have to recognize that if your country suffered what Palestine has suffered, a lot of people would fight back. In fact, your country was probably founded on something like that. Do you have to like the way it's done? No. Can you wish that it was done peacefully? Yes. But then you have to pay attention. You have to read the history and recognize how much peaceful resistance has happened and how it was cracked down on, how people were exiled, how people were killed, how people were brutalized. Because that is the reality of what Palestinians have faced when they have resisted peacefully. Think about what's happening in the US right now. People are peacefully resisting. They are putting tents on the lawns of universities, okay? And they are being met with serious violence from police. Police who, by the way, get trained by Israeli military and police. And that's where most of us live. That's not even in Israel. So can I wish that people would respond peacefully? Sure. Can I believe that I would respond peacefully? Sure. But can I judge other people for how they respond to decades and decades of humiliation and oppression and violence. I find it hard, and I think you have to be pretty arrogant to assume that you would do any better, and if you wouldn't do any better, how harshly can you judge them? Now, I realize that people are using this to justify the Israeli thing. Well, if we were attacked like that, why wouldn't we respond that way? Well, yeah, but we're in countries that are incredibly violent and incredibly arrogant, and that take any kind of response to us swaggering around the world doing whatever the hell we want as a genuine affront to decency. I think that's the main thing that happened on October 7th, is Israel was outraged that they had the audacity to fight back, to attack them. It was this shock, this absolute outrage of how dare you, despite doing similar things to the Palestinian people over the years, just cumulatively far more. But this horror at how dare they do it to us. And I think that's at the core of this, is that some people, some lives, some humans, some races, some religions seem in this discourse to be more valuable than others. The hostages of Israelis, the Israeli hostages, are seen as, well, we need to talk about them. Absolutely, yes, hostages, bad. Don't take hostages, must be horrible for them. It is interesting that we don't talk about the Palestinians held without any kind of civil trial. Children, many of them. Women, many of them. Why is it that we call Israelis captured by a military force for often political ends hostages? But we don't call Palestinian children who threw a little stone at a tank. We don't call them hostages even though they're in prison. We don't call the people who now are being imprisoned. I saw a video today of a beauty shop owner, a Palestinian citizen of Israel who owns a beauty shop, but who liked some tweets or posted a comment in sympathy with the innocents being massacred in Rafah right now. Her being handcuffed, but also blindfolded and taken away to face, I would imagine, a military prison, like every child throwing a stone is facing a military court system. As Christians, we have a responsibility to think and speak about this, not just because it is an issue of justice in the world, and we should, as we should about South Sudan, as we should about Congo, as we should about the evils of capitalism enslaving and torturing people around the world, as we should about Western imperialism and other imperialisms. The reason we should talk about this is because it is backed by us. Because this would not be happening if it wasn't for the church. And for the church falling into the thrall of this weird theology that was not even a thing until the late 19th century. That says that Israel is special and it should have an earthly resurgence in a political sense. That sees Israel and the Jewish people as an apocalyptic tool to immanentize the eschaton, to bring on the end of days. They don't love the Jewish people. They hate Muslims. The white supremacy at the heart of this kind of Christian does not care about anyone except white people. Protestant Christians. It's evil. It's wrong. And our secular political leaders are allowing it to happen. They are funding it happening. And they should be punished. They should be punished ultimately as war criminals, but they should be punished now at the polls. And the idea of them holding us to ransom by saying, well, the alternative is worse. is a kind of weird shifting to us of their responsibility. If you want me to vote for you, be worth voting for. Don't blame me if I don't vote for you and a worse person gets in. Be a better candidate. Whatever your theology, whether you believe that the majority of the New Testament that says that the Christian church is no longer ethnically constituted, but is constituted by people of conscience in their hearts who follow Jesus, which I would say is fairly clear in most of the New Testament. But if you don't believe that, if you believe there's some kind of separate thing happening for a specific ethnicity, that's cool. Can you believe that Jesus Christ, everything you know about him, that he would be okay with what's happening in Gaza right now? And in the West Bank, let's not pretend that the West Bank is not being cracked down on. It's not in flames. They're not allowing settlers to do incredibly brutal things to Palestinian civilians there with the expressed and tacit approval of the Israeli occupation forces. I don't believe Jesus is okay with it. I think that Christians need to stand up. We need to reject the Zionism that we have been raised with or propagandized into and say that we were wrong, that we were duped by a secular system that is primarily about maintaining control of a single empire, of a sense of whiteness, of a sense of capitalism, of a fear of brown people and Arabs and Muslims and any kind of thing that stands against the empire of North Atlantic power bases. We need to say no more. We need to tell our leaders that we do not back them. We need to make them afraid of the whole thing falling apart. Because it's over 30,000 people that are being killed. 30,000 children. We have to do something. We have to keep speaking out. If you haven't been to a march, go to a march. You're not being anti-Semitic. You're not being a terrorist sympathizer. Whatever the fuck that means. You're standing up for justice. You have more in common when you stand up for the Palestinians with a prophet like Amos than you do with any of the things they tell you you should be afraid of being. We worship a God of justice. We worship a God whose heart is for the poor and for the downtrodden. We worship a God who says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. So I believe we shouldn't take vengeance ourselves. But rest assured, God does not forget. And I think what is happening now, the abhorrence, the evil, the awfulness of it, if we are not called to take vengeance, we are at least called to stand up, to bear witness, to say something, to do something, to help people escape for sure. But it's not just about charity for those who are suffering. It's about using our influence to stop them suffering. It is time for Christians to stop being the problem and to start being part of the solution, humbly, walking alongside people who have been the solution for a much longer time, the Palestinian people, in their resistance to oppression, to all the other, to the Jewish peace groups, to all the other people who have been standing up against this. We need to change our ideology and our theology if our ideology and our theology makes this seem okay to us. You've got to recognize that. You've got to stop. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.